that is how the book finishes up. Who knows the heart of the sea? Who knows its depths? And as I read that, I wondered to myself, are we just the little fishes, abandoning ourselves to the waves to sing and dance and play? Is that what we're doing? And I'm not saying don't have fun. I'm not saying don't sing and dance and play. Enjoy life, of course, and relish the joy of life. But I think you have to make sure you don't dance your life away. Don't be one of the little fishes. And in Dokodo, that final writing of Masashi before he died, the last thing he wrote was never stray from the way. And I think that's what this is about. All the fun and the singing and the dancing and all the play, it's okay. It's good. But all those things can be distractions. Because there is a path. There is a way. And you know what that way is. You know what you should be doing. And it's hard to stay on that path because it is the path of discipline and discomfort, but it is the right path. And you know that. And it is that path that will ultimately lead you to where you really want to be. So that you can live and you can die without regrets. I think a lot of times people are trying to find the path and they're looking all around different places and different people and different influences. But man, I think so often that path, you know what the path is and people know what they're supposed to be doing, but they just don't get on the path and stay on the path.
Yeah, I agree. Or it's something they felt when they were 8 or 12 and they travel the world or travel through life's experiences trying to find the answer that was in front of them the entire time. And so they come back to see what they knew with different eyes and to recognize that they knew the path all along, which is something that I so enjoyed about this book and the character, both real and certainly presented by the author of Musashi, who is using his experiences in this domain of the sword as a means of thematic interconnectedness. And so unlike Kojiro at the end, he is not just a technician with the sword, although he is a brilliant technician. Mm-hmm. He's tilling the soil. He's constructing buildings, which later he did quite a lot of in terms of architecture and overseeing the building instead of destruction of things. And finding at the highest levels of performance with the sword in felling opponents the principles, the first principles that he can apply everywhere. And that's part of what fascinates me so much about Musashi, or anyone who's the best at what they do, is that it could be anything. It could be pottery. It could be sniping. It could be calligraphy. But like the best, they see the depth. They see the interwoven web that can expand from that one fine focus into everything that they do. And I think that, for me at least, is the path. And maybe it's just coming off of a silent retreat that I want to talk this way, but it doesn't strike me as something that is cleanly expressed in an Instagram post or a quote necessarily. It's more of a feeling. Like, you know, if you're sober and take a moment to sit in the stillness, and by stillness I don't mean sitting on a mountaintop. It could just be 5 minutes of silence when you first get up in the morning, and observe your own mind and how you feel. Like, you know if you're on the path or not, or at least you know when you're not on it.
I totally agree.
You know when you're not on it. And I think that the feeling of being on it, when you're on the path, it has that beauty of mindlessness, or no mind is what they would say in, say, Zen, the state of no mind. And it sounds like unconscious, but it's different. It's not unconscious. It's not subconscious. It's something else where you feel that you're exactly where you should be, doing exactly what you should be doing. And you're not planning. You're just putting one foot in front of the other on this path that you didn't have to find, because in a way the path was seeking you the whole time. And it's just a feeling. It's a really, it's a feeling I think that everyone can have, but they get so caught up. We all get caught up. Well, I don't want to speak for you two fine gents. I'll speak for myself. It's easy to get caught up in the noise and the shiny objects. And just like the little fish you were talking about earlier, it's like when you see that lure, to recognize it as a lure is sort of the first step. And then to realize that when you look past the lure, all right, there's a lure 16 inches in front of you, and then you're in an ocean that has endless fathoms of depth. What a journey.
Yeah, the line that says the world is always filled with the sound of waves. It's like, yeah, those sounds are going on and the waves are out there and there's little fishies swimming around in the waves. Yeah.
Well, you and I think you've experienced that type of clarity in many different contexts. I haven't surfed much, but I have done a bit, certainly not as regularly as you have. But the feeling of when I've been out in surf that suddenly exceeded my capacities, which is also not necessarily something I recommend, but I've had this harrowing experience, particularly as someone who didn't learn to swim until I was in my 30s, which is a whole separate thing that I think we covered in episode 50. I have fear related to the ocean, which I think is healthy on a lot of levels.
Yeah,
but
it is.
when you're out there and suddenly sets come in that are 70%, 100% bigger than what you went in with, the feeling of, or just sitting calmly on your board waiting for a set and looking out over the water, the sense of insignificance that you feel is not at least that I feel, it's not a negative thing. It's a very, hesitate to use the word, but I can't find a better one, spiritual experience where you're like, oh yeah, that email, that comment on social media, that commitment I made to go to an event that I now really 6 months later don't want to go to. Who gives a fuck? It's like we're a bunch of monkeys on a spinning rock.
Yeah.
In the middle of this whole thing, whatever this whole thing is.
And all that thing is singing and dancing and playing, and it's like, compared to the depths of the ocean, it means nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah, it's I love the purity of, despite his stupidity, let's be honest, right? We already talked about it. Like, he made a lot of stupid decisions. storming the jail. I mean, what do you think's going to happen? And so on and so forth. But despite all that, coming back to what he knew, one of the few things that he felt, I shouldn't say no, felt to be true to him, which was this commitment to the way of the sword. It doesn't have to be a commitment to the way of the sword, but I've always had a certain envy for people, including yourself, who from a very, very early age just felt a beacon for a direction that called them.
You're really lucky. I feel like I was really lucky in that aspect.
Yeah. Or you meet people I've met, for instance, Laird Hamilton, I mentioned him earlier. It's like he still surfs every day, wakes up at 4, stoked to go out and train. And
he's on the path.
He's on the path. And I mean, this is a guy who he was with, I mean, he's out there with large tiger sharks, which are routinely out where he surfs in Hawaii, where he spends a good portion of the year. And I've heard stories, and these are real, these are not several hundred years later embellished stories. These are real stories where someone was bitten by a tiger shark, bleeding out. He went back to a jet ski that they had. It took off some piece of clothing he had, put a makeshift tourniquet on this guy who's bleeding in the water with tiger sharks. Keep in mind, he's already been bitten. The key has been lost to the jet ski, hot wires the jet ski, and brings the guy back and saves him. And I'd say every few months he saves someone's life in the water. And he's in his 50s. We were sitting in a steam room at one point, and I in retrospect realized not a good idea to try to outlast Laird in a steam room. But he was saying roughly along these lines, like once it's 20 feet, you can start to have fun, start to play around. He goes, 20 to 30, yeah, you're really jamming. It's like 30 to 40, you can definitely get into the zone. He's like, above 50, you're not allowed to fall. And that's his day.
Mm-hmm.
And he has kids, but as far as I can tell, Gabby, who's just incredible on so many levels in her own right, she understands, like, this is his path. He's still chasing giants. And he's not going to stop. How could he? Like, that's part of who he is.
What do you think draws people, like, in the wrong direction in their life? I think it's just the little distractions, as you talk about, Echo. It's little distractions, little things that just pull you off. And I think maybe people don't want to accept the fact, like, they know what the path is, but they want to deny it for whatever reason. Like,
I think that can be part of it. The distraction of the path. I mean, I will say, for those people out there who are like, well, for God's sake, like, I don't know what my path is. I can't define it. I don't know if I could say to someone with absolute conviction, my path is X. Mm-hmm. But I can tell when I've strayed, if that makes sense. There's a certain agitation. There's a certain scattered feeling that I have. And as to reasons people get off the path, and I think people may have multiple paths, but you were going to say?
I was going to say, because I'm trying to formulate what we're talking about, because I know exactly what you mean. Like the path is, it might not be like, hey, I want to do this thing. Like, there's something else. And I think the something else is, the path is how you are going to live.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily a destination. That you could follow the same path and get to a bunch of different destinations, but the path itself of how you're going to live, how you're going to go through life, how you're going to do things, that's what I'm talking about. And even the path that I'm on could have led to other things in my life. And even though, I was in the military for 20 years, I'm not in the military anymore. I'm still on the same path. Like, the path is the same of the way I'm trying to live my life. That's the same. And when I'm in business, the way I run my business, I'm on the same path. So the path, it's like the way you're living your life more than anything else. And it doesn't matter if you're in college, if you're starting a business, if you're working for someone. Are you on the path that you're supposed to be on? Are you living the way that you feel you're supposed to live, that you know you're supposed to live? I think people get off that. They get off that, and they're not living the way that they know they should live, regardless of circumstances. You've been in horrible circumstances before. We all go in situations where things just went sideways, and you can either stray off the path and turn into something that you're not, or something that you know you shouldn't be, or you can stay on the path. You can continue to do the things that you're supposed to do and live the way that you want to live. And really, lately I've been talking about, because I've been trying to explain this, you know what the right thing to do is, right? You know what you're supposed to do as a person, as you. You know what you're supposed to do. Do it. Do that thing. What is that thing that you're supposed to? You know you're supposed to live a certain way. And when you don't live that way, like you said, there's friction and there's tension and there's disruption, and it doesn't feel right. And when you live the right way, it's often harder. It often is less immediate gratification, but the internal gratification that you get from living the way you're supposed to live is very satisfying. And another thing I need to absolutely point out is I am by no means sitting here trying to say that I've always maintained I'm the worst human ever. I'm horrible. And I was on with a guy named Charlie Plum, came on the podcast, and a guy named Jim Kunkel. Charlie Plum was a Vietnam fighter pilot, shot down, spent 6 years in the Hanoi Hilton. And another guy named Jim Kunkel, who was a fighter pilot in World War II. And we got in this conversation like about, doing good. And these guys are just infinite levels above me as far as being good people. And I kind of went along with the conversation almost as if I was one of their, like, had that level of goodness, which I don't, I mean, I'm trying, but, when I was a young SEAL, I was a maniac. I made Musashi look like a brilliant saint in his youth. I was a crazy maniac kid filled with just mayhem in my brain. And all my friends, we were all the same, and we got after it. And so, believe me, I'm not trying to say that, but I will say that as I've grown up, I've gotten myself closer to living the way that I know I'm supposed to live, or what I believe to be the right way and the right path to be on. And, so I just wanted to make that quick caveat that anybody that's listening that's like, oh, wow, Jocko is really just a saintly person. Wrong. I'm not even remotely making that claim. But I am trying. I'll give myself at least that much credit.
Well, I think that everyone is a work in progress, and that the path, so to speak, is illustrated for me in this book, and I'll get into a couple of specifics that might be helpful for people to think about, or at least have been helpful to me as I think through what distinguishes the relative lack of friction and scatteredness and agitation versus states without those things. Because being on the path is not necessarily, for me, a feeling of overwhelming joy and happiness per se. It's a lack of excess agitation and distractedness. And I think that what I've found for myself is that as I get older and feel more at peace with what I'm doing and how I'm behaving, like you said, it's having certain first principles in mind that transcend any given project, any given conversation, any one relationship. And early on, it's as you're hoping to define yourself or find yourself or build yourself, you very often succumb, because how could you not, to pursuing shiny object after shiny object. And in the beginning, I think that's fine. And even for a very long period of time, you throw a lot against the wall to see what sticks and to discover what you're good at, what you're terrible at, what your weaknesses are, what your strengths are. But over time, whether you're looking at some of the most successful investors in the world, like Ray Dalio of Bridgewater Associates, they manage $160 billion at last count, and or athletes like Marcelo Garcia, who will not train a technique that he cannot use on a 300-pound muscular opponent. He just will not train. He does not drill techniques that he cannot apply to someone twice his size. And these are principles, right? Whether it's, say, and you can take principles from one domain and transplant them, which is why I think this book is such an excellent illustration of the value of becoming exceptionally good at something in a very, very narrow band. Because when you do that, the constitution and the frameworks and the principles that you develop for yourself can then be applied everywhere. So in jiu-jitsu, let's just say, and I'm talking out my ass a little bit since I certainly don't feel qualified to speak too much on jiu-jitsu at this table, but if you take something like position before submission, right? Let's just say for whatever reason you adopt that and that's worked very well for you. You can apply that to a lot, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
You can apply that to a lot of things. And when you start to really think about precepts and principles, and the Dokodo, that last short book or treatise of Musashi is in effect a bulleted list of precepts. And pretty tough to follow all of them at the same time, by the way, if you read them. But if you just have a few, and they can be very plain, very much plain speech. I mean, let's just say it's say what you mean what you say. Do what you say you are going to do on time. I mean, very simple, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have a recipe book. You have an algorithm, which is really just a set of steps that produce a given known predetermined outcome usually. If you follow those, you can start to mold and define this path, your way of moving through the world and interacting with the world. But if you're stuck in, say, the weather patterns of the world, instead of looking at sort of the tectonic plate level, and you're focused on these things that change very, very quickly, like the news cycle, like what your friends are saying on social media at all times, the fear of missing out and social expectations that are set that make you want to posture because all of your friends are putting highlights of their lives on the internet, which makes you feel like a failure because it's not all glamour shots. Those are all just shifting weather patterns. They mean nothing. Yeah. And you should let those pass. As they say in this book, it comes up a lot. As much as froth. Yeah. Froth. That comes up a lot in Musashi. And flies, right? Froth and flies and insects. These passing phenomena versus thinking about, in his case, he uses the mountains and so on. But the lower levels that tend to be they're less sexy. They don't move as quickly. But if you understand those slower moving and just by extension, timeless principles, and you can use those to carve and form and find, rediscover your own path, then I think it just gives you a much greater level of peace, in part because it gives you a much greater level of agency. You feel like you can craft your experience of life as opposed to being tossed back and forth by the vagaries of fast changing factors you have no control over.
Man, well, I suppose we could talk about this indefinitely, but we're using up too much bandwidth already. Echo, speaking of the path, do you have any recommendations of maybe how people could stay on the path and you know, maybe even support?
Sure. Real quick though, as far as pronunciation goes, when there's like a double consonant, you kind of say them both, huh? Like this Dokodo, you say Dokodo.
Yeah, and there's a little stutter in it.
Yeah, because it's almost like you got to finish the first K and then start the second K.
Yeah, it's kind of I think it would be considered what they call a glottal stop. So like Hokkaido in Japan is actually Hokkaido.
Right. But if there was only one K, it'd be Hokkaido.
That's right.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah, or school. It took me a long time to, which was really embarrassing. In the beginning, working on my pronunciation, I had to say the word school a lot. I was going to school, walking to school. When are you going to school? And it's gakko. which has that little stutter.
Yeah.
And man, did I mess that up.
Yeah.
Well, I certainly cast a broad apology to all of my Japanese friends, especially.
Yeah.
They're going to be going crazy. I'm sorry.
It's interesting that you care, because in the Hawaiian language they put it's actually considered another letter. It's called the okina. It's basically an apostrophe.
Yeah.
And that in Hawaii there's a lot of vowels go together, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you want to do that little function to separate them, you put the okina there, like the word Hawaii. There's two I's at the end, so you say Hawaii. Remember you were asking me, how do you say kauai? How do you say kauai? Is it kauai or kauai? I think technically it's kauai. But people typically don't say kauai anymore. That's a whole nother thing.
Very, very similar.
But similar deal, right?
Similar deal.
Except this is with consonants, straight up.
Yeah, and I don't want to take us too far afield, but there are some really weird similarities between Japanese and other languages where there may have been trade routes established before the dawn of man in weird places. So there are some commonalities in Polynesian languages. And then you also find incredible commonalities with Turkish of all languages.
Yeah.
Nearly identical grammar.
I remember when I was taking linguistic classes, and they would point out these weird commonalities that you say, wow, that's, like things that, like the number one, things like the sun, things that, everyone kind of has to have created a word for at some point. Yeah, there's definitely some strings, and I forget what they are. I didn't study hard enough. I wasn't on the path freaking closely enough.
But a lot of these languages, like even the pronunciation of like a is ah. Japanese, Hawaiian.
Yeah.
All
very
these other
very
ones.
soft vowels typically.
Yeah.
A, E, O, U.
Yeah. And then the I is like E.
Yeah. Japanese people can handle. Spanish is probably the closest that I've seen language that they can handle. Any language that ends on consonants a lot is going to be so hard.
Yeah.
I remember, they have such a tough time.
They add the U at the end.
Yeah,
Timu. You said Timu.
If they say
biru.
Or, biru, namabiru. McDonald's is McDonaldo.
Yeah.
And, man, they have a tough time. But and for those people wondering, the reason they can't or have so much trouble distinguishing between R's and L's, which many other Asian people do not. But in the case of Japanese, is because they have a blended phoneme, a blended sound. It's a combination of R, L, and D. So ra, ri, ru, re, ro is how they say it. So that ru, that like sound is not clearly distinguished into multiple consonants in Japanese, which is why they have so much trouble with R's and L's. But you can teach them to fix that in a few minutes if you explain how the tongue is positioned. And I remember at one point, I give credit to my first Japanese teacher, Mr. Shimano, who was fantastic because we would hit a sticking point in class. We'd be going over some concept that was really difficult for a native English speaker's brain to wrap itself around. Like they have subject markers and the difference between wa and ga, and if it's known to the speaker, it's this. If it's not known to the speaker, it's that. And you're like, wait, what? Like, what does that even mean? And he could sense, because I transferred from a very weak school, a very bad school on Long Island to a very highly competitive school in New Hampshire that had classes 6 days a week, mandatory seated meal like Dead Poet Society, mandatory sports, classes from 8 a.m. or so to about 6 p.m. And the Japanese class was very often the class after sports, so people were wiped out, hadn't had dinner, and we'd be struggling and getting agitated with some aspect of Japanese, and he could tell that we were losing it. But we still had 45 minutes to go. So he'd say, all right, had a really strong Japanese accent, and he'd be like, we're going to stop for a minute, and I'm going to attempt to say this word for you. And he would write squirrel on the blackboard. If you want to talk about a word that would be designed to be kryptonite for a Japanese person. And so he would take like 5 minutes for just comedic effect to just go squirr, squirr, squirr. And he'd do that for like a few minutes, and we'd crack up and loosen up and realize, okay, everyone who's learning a new language has some type of sticking point like this. And then he'd be like, okay, enough fun and games. Now back to the hard stuff. Yeah. He was an excellent, excellent teacher.
Yeah, that's good.
Legit.